Picture this. You're getting ready for your morning shower. Hot water, soap, maybe some music playing. A normal, refreshing start to your day. Now imagine instead of water cascading down, it's warm human blood. Fresh blood. Daily. For decades. You think that's horrific? You think Elizabeth Bathory was the ultimate monster of history for her alleged bloodbaths? Think again. What if I told you there was a queen who made Bathory's supposed crimes look like child's play? A queen who didn't just bathe in blood occasionally during fits of madness, but who turned it into a daily ritual. A systematic, calculated practice that lasted for over 40 years. A queen whose story was so disturbing historians actively tried to erase it from the records. You're thinking of Elizabeth Bathory right now, aren't you? The Blood Countess of Hungary, who supposedly killed 650 young women to bathe in their blood, believing it would preserve her youth. But here's the thing, most of Bathory's story is likely exaggerated legend mixed with political propaganda. The real evidence suggests she killed maybe a dozen people if that. Horrible, yes, but not the systematic blood-bathing monster we've been told about. But there was another queen. A queen whose blood rituals were documented, witnessed, and recorded by multiple sources. A queen who didn't kill for vanity or madness, but for something far more chilling religious devotion. A queen who believed that bathing in human blood was her divine duty. Her name was Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar, and her story will make you question everything you think you know about historical monsters. While you're complaining about your morning routine, imagine waking up in 1828 Madagascar, where the queen's daily bloodbath meant 20 people would die before breakfast. Where the sound of screaming from the palace courtyard was as regular as a rooster's crow. Where the royal pools ran red not with dye, but with the life force of her own subjects. You think medieval torture was bad? You think the Inquisition was brutal? Ranavalona turned murder into a morning ritual and genocide into governance. She didn't just bathe in blood. She swam in it. She didn't just kill her enemies, she killed her friends for sport. And unlike Bathory's isolated castle, Ranavalona's bloodbaths happened in full view of thousands, normalized, institutionalized, turned into entertainment. But here's what will really shock you. She didn't do this in some dark medieval period. This was happening in the 1800s. While Britain was building railways and America was expanding west, Madagascar had a queen who made Vlad the Impaler look merciful. While the world was supposedly becoming more civilized, she was proving that humans could still sink to depths that would make demons uncomfortable. And the most disturbing part? She wasn't considered insane by her people. She wasn't seen as a monster. She was worshipped as a goddess. The bloodbaths weren't hidden away. They were celebrated. The murders weren't secret, they were festivals. What does that tell you about the nature of power, about the capacity for human evil, about how quickly civilization can crumble? Stay with me, because this story gets so much worse. We're not just talking about a few bloodbaths. We're talking about a systematic reign of terror that lasted 3 decades. We're talking about a queen who killed an estimated 2 million people. That's more than Hitler killed in the Holocaust, but concentrated in a tiny island nation. We're talking about blood rituals that were so elaborate, so frequent, and so brutal that they redefined what it means to be human. I've spent months researching this story, digging through missionary accounts, colonial records, and Malagasy oral histories. What I found will haunt you. Because this isn't just a story about one evil queen. It's a story about how quickly paradise can become hell, how easily humans can normalize the unthinkable, and how the worst monsters in history often wear crowns. Welcome to the true story of the forgotten queen who bathed in blood daily, and why Elizabeth Bathory's legend pales in comparison to Ranavalona's reality. To understand the true horror of what Ranavalona did, you have to understand the world she inherited. Picture Madagascar in 1828. A tropical paradise, larger than France, with lush rainforests, pristine beaches, and a population of about 3 million people living in relative peace. The Marina Kingdom had been unified under strong but generally benevolent rulers. Trade was flourishing. Christian missionaries were building schools and hospitals. And the island seemed poised to enter the modern world. You would have walked through Antananarivo, the capital, and seen bustling markets filled with silk, rice, and precious stones, children learning to read in mission schools, skilled craftsmen working iron and wood. The royal palace, called the Rova, stood majestically on the highest hill, its wooden walls gleaming in the tropical sun. It looked like civilization was taking root. But beneath this peaceful surface, ancient traditions simmered. The Marina people believed in the spiritual power of blood and the connection between the living and the dead through ritual sacrifice. They practiced tangina trial by ordeal using poison to determine guilt or innocence. Most importantly, they believed their ruler was not just a political leader, but a divine intermediary, a living god whose will could not be questioned. When Ranavalona took power in 1828, she was already in her 30s. A woman who had watched her husband, King Radama I, embrace foreign influences and Christian teachings. She had seen missionaries gain influence, foreign traders extract wealth, and traditional ways begin to fade. And she had made a decision that would cost millions of lives. She would restore the old ways, no matter the cost. The first bloodbath happened within weeks of her coronation. According to missionary William Ellis, who witnessed it, Ranavalona announced that the ancestors were displeased with foreign contamination of the kingdom. To purify the realm, she would perform the ancient ritual of Famba, a blood sacrifice designed to cleanse spiritual pollution. But instead of sacrificing a bull or a few chickens as tradition demanded, she ordered the execution of everyone who had been contaminated by foreign influence. You would have been standing in the palace courtyard, pressed shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of others, forced to watch the morning sun burning into your skin. And then the soldiers came, dragging the first victims. Christians. Anyone who could read European script. Anyone who dared to own foreign goods. Then she appeared. The Queen. Scarlet robes trailing behind her. Her face painted with white clay and red ochre. She didn't look human. She looked like a demon risen from the underworld. The killing wasn't quick. Each victim was forced to drink the Tangina poison. While she watched, watching their faces, watching them convulse and die. And those who survived the poison, they were clubbed to death anyway, because they had been accused, and accusation alone was enough. The blood was sacred. It was collected in hand-carved wooden bowls, mixed with herbs, heated over fires that filled the courtyard, with smoke so thick it burned your eyes and your throat. But it didn't end there. The blood wasn't just for ritual. It was for her daily bath. Each time a victim died, their blood was carried into the palace, poured into stone pools carved specifically for this horror. Ranavalona would step inside, submerge herself completely, rub the blood into her skin. While chanting prayers to the ancestors, she believed that every death made her stronger, more divine, untouchable. James Cameron, a missionary who hid and watched, described it in terrifying detail. She would stay in that pool for hours, sometimes drinking the blood from golden cups, emerging like a creature from hell, her skin stained red, her hair soaked, her eyes wild, consumed with something that looked like religious ecstasy. The first mass bloodbath? Over 200 people. In a single day. The pools ran red for weeks. Salt and herbs preserved the blood. The rituals continued. Long after the bodies were gone. The smell of death? It never left the capital. It hung in the air, like a curse. But this was just the beginning. What began as a cleansing ritual became monthly, then weekly, then daily. Ranavalona discovered something. These bloodbaths didn't just give her power, they gave her control. Every morning, people would wake up wondering, who will die today? For the Queen's bath? Every night, families would pray. They'd live to see the sunrise. Terror became a system. Guards patrolled the streets, snatching anyone who looked suspicious, anyone who whispered, anyone who caught her eye. Children were taught to spy on their parents. Neighbors were told to report neighbors. The entire kingdom became a blood farm. The royal treasurer even kept records noting the victims, the amount of blood, the tools used. This wasn't madness, it was method, it was policy. And the blood? It wasn't just for bathing. She would drink it during sacred rites. She would anoint her weapons with it before battle. She would even feed it to her most loyal advisors, binding them to her with blood. Creating a circle of killers, devoted not by loyalty, but by ritual. The real horror of Ranavalona's bloodbaths wasn't just the brutality, it was how it evolved into government. By 1835, 7 years into her reign, the blood ritual had become the foundation of royal law, religion, and administration. Step into Antananarivo, and you'd feel it, the fear. Once a city of trade and laughter, now silent, tense. No eye contact, no raised voices. Why? Because at any moment you could be chosen. Ranavalona's method? She called it divine judgment. She would throw bones, read blood patterns on cloth, or sometimes just point into the crowd. The point was randomness. When no one felt safe, everyone obeyed. And still it got worse. She didn't just want victims, she wanted types. Young women for beauty, children for foresight, warriors for strength, pregnant women for fertility. Each one killed a different way to preserve their so-called spiritual essence. The palace was redesigned around blood. Stone channels, execution stages, pools for daily baths, ceremonial baths, and blood mixing. One pool alone held over 500 gallons. Dozens had to die just to fill it. And the logistics? Horrifyingly efficient. Blood coagulates fast. So victims were killed in perfect sequence to keep the flow fresh. They added salt, herbs, sometimes wine, anything to preserve it. It required dozens of attendants, specialists, executioners. And Rana Valona? She got better at it. She studied anatomy, learned how to bleed victims faster, created tools, knives with blood channels, measuring cups for exact amounts. She turned death into a science, a ritual, a government, a way of life, a legacy soaked in blood. The psychological impact on the population was devastating. Malagasy oral history, passed down through generations, describes a kingdom where parents would kill their own children rather than let them be taken for the bloodbaths, where entire villages would commit mass suicide when they learned the queen's forces were approaching, where people would mutilate themselves to make their blood impure and unsuitable for royal use. But the real horror was how normalized it became. By 1840, an entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but the bloodbaths. Children played games mimicking the executions. Artists created sculptures celebrating the queen's divine power through blood. Musicians composed songs about the beauty of the ritual. What had begun as shocking brutality had become everyday reality. The missionary David Johns, who managed to remain hidden in Madagascar for 3 years, documented the evolution of the blood ritual in his secret diary. He wrote that the queen's daily bath had become a public spectacle, with nobles competing for the privilege of watching. The execution grounds were expanded to accommodate crowds. Food vendors sold refreshments to spectators. The slaughter of innocents had become entertainment. The bloodbaths also became a form of political control more sophisticated than any European system. Rana Valona would time mass executions to coincide with potential rebellions. She would target the families of suspected traitors, making resistance impossible when it meant watching your children die for the queen's bath. She would vary the victims to keep different groups in line: merchants one day, farmers the next, nobles when they grew too bold. The international community was horrified, but helpless. European powers sent diplomatic missions to try to reason with Rana Valona. But she would respond by having the diplomats watch mass executions followed by her bloodbath. She understood that the sheer scale of her brutality was itself a weapon. Who could comprehend, let alone fight someone who killed thousands for a daily bath? The most disturbing accounts come from the palace servants who were forced to assist with the bloodbaths. These testimonies, recorded by missionaries who eventually escaped, describe a queen who had become something beyond human. She would speak to the blood as if it were alive, thank each victim personally for their sacrifice, and express genuine confusion when foreigners called her actions cruel. In her mind, she wasn't committing murder. She was performing a sacred duty, one that sustained the spiritual health of the kingdom. The daily routine of death became so systematic that the kingdom operated like a vast machine designed to produce blood. Every morning at dawn, while you were still asleep in your bed, the selection process would begin. Palace guards would receive their quotas, sometimes 5 victims, sometimes 50, depending on the queen's spiritual needs or political requirements. The sound of doors breaking down, of families screaming, of children crying for their parents became the kingdom's morning alarm. You would have heard it too if you lived in Antananarivo. The sound would wake you from whatever restless sleep you'd managed. Your stomach would clench with relief that it wasn't your door, followed immediately by guilt for being grateful that someone else would die for your safety. This was the psychological warfare of the bloodbaths. They turned survival into complicity, relief into shame. The technical precision was terrifying. By 1842, 14 years into her reign, Rana Valona had perfected the timing. Victims would be brought to the palace exactly 1 hour before sunrise. They would be held in stone chambers designed to maximize their terror-small spaces where they could hear the screams of those who went before them, where they could smell the blood of previous victims, where they could see the stains on the walls that told the story of their fate. The queen herself would arrive precisely at sunrise, her timing as regular as clockwork. She would inspect the victims like a farmer checking livestock, selecting which blood would be used for her bath, which for drinking, which for ceremonies. The rejected victims weren't spared. They were simply killed differently, their blood used for lesser purposes like blessing weapons or feeding to the palace dogs. But it gets worse. The bloodbaths weren't just about killing people, they were about breaking the human spirit entirely. Ranavalona developed psychological techniques that would make modern torturers study her methods. She would force parents to watch their children die, then thank her for the privilege. She would make entire communities participate in selecting victims from among themselves, turning neighbors into executioners. The most horrifying technique was what she called graduated sacrifice. A family would be brought before the queen, and she would kill one member while sparing the others. The survivors would be told they were safe as long as they served faithfully. Days, weeks, or months later, she would kill another family member, then another, stretching the psychological torture across years. Entire bloodlines would be slowly consumed for the queen's baths, with the survivors never knowing when their turn would come. The sensory details of the bloodbaths are almost too disturbing to describe. The smell alone would have been overwhelming, not just the metallic scent of blood, but the stench of fear, sweat, and death that permeated the palace. The sound was worse not just the screams of the dying, but the wet sounds of blood being collected, the splash of bodies falling into pools, the queen's own voice chanting prayers of gratitude to the ancestors. You would have seen the aftermath in the streets, the blood-stained clothes of the executioners hanging out to dry, the red-tinged water flowing from the palace drains, the pale, shocked faces of the palace servants who had witnessed the morning's ritual, the way people would cross themselves or touch protective amulets when they passed the palace walls. The kingdom's economy became entirely centered around death. Entire industries developed to support the blood bath specialists in blood preservation, craftsmen who made ceremonial killing tools, priests who blessed the victims before slaughter. The kingdom's calendar was restructured around the ritual schedule. Religious festivals were timed to coincide with mass executions. Trade routes were planned to ensure fresh supplies of victims from outlying areas. International accounts from the period describe a kingdom that had become something beyond human comprehension. Captain William Kelly of the British Navy wrote in 1844 that approaching Madagascar felt like sailing toward hell itself. The smell of death carried on the wind for miles offshore. The beaches were littered with the bodies of those who had tried to escape by swimming. The very air seemed poisoned by the scale of the killing. The psychological impact on Ranavalona herself was profound. Contemporary accounts describe her transformation from a relatively normal queen into something that seemed barely human. She would speak to her reflection in the blood pools, carry on conversations with the spirits of the dead, and laugh during the most brutal executions. She developed rituals around the bloodbaths that became increasingly elaborate and bizarre, dancing in the blood, painting symbols on the palace walls with victims' blood, even feeding blood to sacred animals. The most disturbing development was how the bloodbaths became a form of religious worship. Ranavalona convinced her subjects that the killings were necessary to maintain the spiritual balance of the kingdom. She claimed that each death prevented natural disasters, that the blood sacrifices kept the ancestors happy, that without the daily ritual, the kingdom would be destroyed by divine wrath. People began to genuinely believe that the murders were not just necessary but sacred. By 1861, 33 years into her reign, Ranavalona had killed an estimated 2 million people, nearly two-thirds of Madagascar's population. The kingdom that had once been a tropical paradise had become a wasteland of terror. Entire regions were depopulated, cities were abandoned. The economy had collapsed completely, existing only to serve the machinery of death. And still, every morning, the queen would wake and demand her daily bath of blood. The end came not from rebellion or foreign invasion, but from something far more mundane: old age and the simple mathematics of genocide. There simply weren't enough people left to sustain the bloodbaths. The queen's own forces had been decimated by her paranoid purges. The palace servants who knew how to properly prepare the blood rituals had been executed for imagined slights. The kingdom had literally consumed itself. Ranavalona's final bloodbath, according to palace records found after her death, required the slaughter of the last 37 members of her own royal guard. She had become so paranoid, so consumed by the ritual, that she killed even her most loyal supporters. She died alone in her blood-stained palace, surrounded by the bones of 2 million victims, having achieved the ultimate isolation that comes from absolute power exercised without restraint. The aftermath was almost as horrifying as the reign itself. When French colonial forces finally entered Madagascar in 1896, they found a kingdom that had been reduced to a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The palace pools were still stained with blood 35 years after the queen's death. The execution grounds were carpeted with bone fragments. The very soil of the capital was contaminated with the remains of countless victims. But here's what should truly terrify you: this wasn't ancient history. This was happening in the 1800s, during the same period when Charles Darwin was writing On the Origin of Species, when the United States was fighting its Civil War, when Europe was entering the Industrial Age. While the Western world was supposedly becoming more civilized, more enlightened, more humane, Madagascar was proving that the capacity for absolute evil hasn't diminished with time. The psychological techniques Ranavalona developed were studied by totalitarian regimes throughout the 20th century. The systematic use of terror, the normalization of mass murder, the way she turned survival into complicity, these methods were employed by Stalin, Hitler, and Pol Pot. The bloodbaths of Madagascar became a template for how to destroy not just bodies but souls. What makes this story even more disturbing is how it was almost erased from history. Colonial powers found the truth so horrific that they actively suppressed accounts of Ranavalona's reign. European historians dismissed missionary reports as exaggerations. The true scale of the genocide only became clear in the late 20th century when oral histories were finally recorded and palace records were properly translated. This erasure wasn't accidental, it was intentional. The story of Ranavalona challenges our comfortable assumptions about human progress, about civilization, about the nature of power itself. It forces us to confront the possibility that the thin veneer of civilization can be stripped away in a single generation, that human beings are capable of horrors that make fictional monsters look benign. The legacy of the bloodbaths continues to haunt Madagascar today. The population has never fully recovered from the demographic catastrophe. The trauma passed down through generations affects social structures, trust in authority, and collective memory. The island that could have been a prosperous, modern nation was instead scarred by 3 decades of unimaginable brutality. But perhaps the most important lesson is how easily the unthinkable becomes normal. Ranavalona's first bloodbath was shocking, horrifying, unacceptable. By her last, it was routine, expected, mundane. The progression from civilization to barbarity happened gradually, day by day, death by death, until an entire kingdom accepted mass. This is why we must remember Ranavalona, not to satisfy our morbid curiosity, but to recognize the warning signs. When authority becomes absolute, when power is exercised without restraint, when violence becomes normalized, when questioning becomes forbidden, these are the conditions that created the bloodbaths of Madagascar. And they're the same conditions that have led to genocide throughout history. They're the same conditions we must guard against today. The next time you step into your morning shower, remember that simple luxury? The right to wash without causing death, to begin your day without terror, to live without the constant threat of arbitrary violence. These aren't givens. They're achievements of civilization. And they must be protected, defended, and never taken for granted. Because somewhere in the world, there's always another potential Ranavalona, waiting for the right conditions, to turn paradise into hell. The only question is, will we recognize the warning signs before it's too late? If this story has shocked you, if it's made you question what you thought you knew about human nature, then subscribe for more untold histories that will challenge everything you believe about the past. Next week, we'll explore another forgotten monster, one whose crimes make today's headlines look like children's games. And trust me, after learning about the bloodbaths of Madagascar, you'll never look at power the same way again. Hit that notification bell, because history's darkest secrets are waiting to be uncovered. And some stories are too important to forget. No matter how much they disturb us,